Part 5, Section 2, Chapter 30 of Short History of the Christian Church by John Fletcher Hurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30, Theology of the American Church. The early American theology was serious and fundamental. The doctrinal differences of the Old World had caused the Puritan emigration. The thinking revolved about the foundations of Christianity. Never was so much theological meditation, fortified by appropriate Scripture proofs, produced amid such humble surroundings as in our early New England colonies. The echoes from the Westminster Assembly were heard throughout New England, and produced their effect in the log house of the humblest colony. Theological terms were well understood, and the finer points had their discriminating judges in men clad in homespun. The Bible was uppermost in every mind. A doctrinal tenet which was purely speculative and had no direct scriptural proof passed as of little value. The Westminster Catechism, the Savoy Confession, and the 39 Articles of the Church of England were the universal bases of belief. These were claimed to be derived directly from the Bible, and stood next to it in the love of the people. The Scriptures were read daily in the domestic circle, and often the head of the family used the original Hebrew and Greek. Scriptural themes were frequent in academic use. Cotton Mather's address, on taking his degree as Bachelor of Arts, was based on the divinity of the Hebrew points. "We record," says an author, "at our country's origin a favorable impulse to the employment of our native good sense in theological investigation; for our fathers made an open renunciation of all prescriptive systems, and took the Bible alone for their text book." The liberalizing period came as a result of the introduction of the halfway covenant. Many persons coming into the Church without profession of regeneration, a large amount of loose theology came with them. Less attention was given to the confessions. The Bible was regarded as of less importance than in the earlier time. Many people looked upon the severer thinking of their fathers as good enough for the beginning of colonial life, but not suited to the more advanced period. The reaction against the scriptural letter opened wide the door for a too liberal theological tendency. The result was the Unitarian revolt. The controversial period was the next stage in our theology. While the great revival at the middle of the 18th century did much to restore the old theological firmness, the tendency now was to a discussion of great scriptural themes. Jonathan Edwards, of Northampton, by his work on the Freedom of the Will, opened the door to a line of controversy which has broken out afresh at intervals ever since. His work was the best philosophical structure ever reared on the Calvinistic theology, whether in the Old World or the New. The Congregationalists were most affected by this controversy. While the Presbyterians were agitated by the discussion, they were never diverted from a line which they early chose, the literary qualifications of their ministry, a thorough Christian experience, and a zeal in occupying new territory. The favorite theological textbooks of the pre-Revolutionary period had been Ames's Medulla, Wohleb's Compendium, and Willard's Body of Divinity. But some other works came in to take their place. The writings of Edwards, who is the real founder of New England theology, took the place of these primitive works. The three authors who built on the Edwardian foundation were Bellamy, in his True Religion; Smalley, in his Distinction between Natural and Moral Inability; and Hopkins, in his Reduction of Disinterested Love to a System of Theology. The Hopkinsian theology was a toning down of the strict Calvinism of Edwards and his school. The leaders were Hopkins, Bellamy, the younger Edwards, West, Spring, and Emmons. They differed from the elder Calvinism as to the nature of human depravity, the imputation of Adam's sin, the nature and extent of the atonement, and the natural inability of the unregenerate to become Christians. They were warm advocates of revivals, benevolent institutions, and missionary movements, and they founded the Theological Magazine, New York, the Evangelical Magazine, Connecticut, and the Missionary Magazine, Massachusetts. The strict Edwardian Calvinists and the Hopkinsians were two distinct classes at the beginning of the present century. Each operated on the other favorably. In due time they approached and amalgamated, though without any formal action. The union of the Calvinistic Panoplist with the Hopkinsian Missionary Magazine in 1808 was one of the public evidences of the amalgamation. Leonard Woods, of Andover, was a judicious and moderate theologian, who stood squarely on Calvinistic principles without pushing them to an extreme. Nathaniel Emmons, of Franklin, Massachusetts, carried still further Hopkins's liberalizing of Edwards. He emphasized the freedom of the will and free volition as essential to every good or bad act. He rejected the transference of Christ's righteousness. The influence of this godly and venerable pastor and theologian was most profound on later New England thought. Nathaniel W. Taylor, of the Divinity School of Yale College, sought to relieve the Calvinistic doctrine of sin of its difficulties. His theological lectures and works created widespread consternation among the more conservative, and led to the formation of the East Windsor, Connecticut, Theological School under Bennett Taylor, his bitter opponent. This institution has developed into the present Hartford Theological Seminary. Edwards A. Park, the pupil of Emmons, was the Nathaniel W. Taylor of Andover. He was a teacher of great intellectual acuteness and breadth, and completely emancipated the Congregational theology from the last remnant of strict Calvinism. The quickening power of his influence on multitudes of pupils who have carried his theological method further than the master is one of the most notable facts in the recent history of the Church. The present Andover theology is in the direct line of this development. It is due to the extension of the idea of the universal atonement of Christ. The recent trial of the Andover professors for heresy, under the Seminary Creed, has been decided by the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, though on another and technical issue, in favor of the professors. The Unitarian development arose as a protest against the old Calvinism, and was fostered by the intellectual atmosphere of New England and the decline of spiritual religion. It has recently thrown out many of those positive elements which linked it to historic Christianity. Some of its representatives have adopted the extreme of German rationalism, while others adhere to the borderland of the Orthodox faith. The Presbyterian Church has gone through a similar experience with the Congregational. It has been helpless to prevent the disintegration of the severer creeds of the post-Reformation age. The old school fought tenaciously for the traditional conceptions, but at the reunion of the Church in 1870, the new school obtained complete recognition. It was the ruling school in the North. Henry B. Smith, professor in the Union Theological Seminary, New York, from 1850 until his resignation on account of ill health in 1874, was the real father of the most modern and aggressive Presbyterian theology. The notable personality of this devout scholar and theologian is one of the rare heritages of the American Church. The Hodges, of Princeton, were able champions of the old school. At present Princeton stands as the representative of the strict orthodoxy of the Presbyterian Church. In the Union Theological Seminary, Professor Charles A. Briggs, the pupil and follower of Henry B. Smith, is under trial for heresy. The partnership between Princeton and Union in the conduct of a most able and admirable theological periodical, the Presbyterian Review, 1880 to 89, was dissolved. A revision of the Westminster Confession has been undertaken, which is proceeding on very conservative lines. The present outlook is, that the younger and more progressive thinkers, the pupils of Smith, Schaff, and Hitchcock, and like-minded theologians, will yet occupy hospitable places in their ancestral home. The Irenical period is the latest stage in American theology. While each of the great religious denominations has its theological system, and has developed its systematic theology from the basis of its confession, there has been a notable absence of the polemic spirit. The Edwardian theory of the will has been ably answered by Whedon, from an American point of view, but without acrimony. The universal tendency now is, in treating doctrinal theology, not to pull down another, but to build up one's own system. Everywhere the spirit is constructive. In spite of appearances that indicate the contrary, the animus of theology at present is peaceful and mediatory. The purpose is more and more to emphasize the great underlying truths on which all churches stand, and to free the evangelical faith from embarrassing and unnecessary inferences and additions. The reconciling influence of Arminian theology, which at the beginning of the 19th century was dreaded as a dangerous importation, has been most salutary. But there are many factors which have contributed towards a larger tolerance and a more generous Catholicity. The churches are uniting on a basis of the fundamental doctrines of Christ to carry on an aggressive campaign against the kingdom of darkness. The points of disagreement are seen to be comparatively few and minor. The true growth of the Church, both in spiritual power and in the respect and homage of men, is found to be not only consistent with the free expression of individual opinion and the untrammeled development of theology, but to require such freedom of expression and development. The essential doctrines of the gospel were never more cordially believed than is the case today. The American Church is more and more inclined to settle down on the cardinal truths of Christianity, and, without laying again the foundations, or compromising any of the essentials of belief, to go forward to meet the great questions which humanity has too long been asking, but in vain. End of chapter 30.